Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. The sky over Brookhaven that morning looked like it couldn't make up its mind, half golden promise, half a storm chewing its nails. Daniel Price adjusted his collar in the mirror of his apartment, watching the reflection of a man whose suit fit better than his peace of mind. He told himself the jitters were normal. Everyone got cold feet when they were on the edge of forever. But beneath the smile that people mistook for confidence was a quiet throb of unrest, something he couldn't put a name to. The wedding was 6 days away. He'd signed the final payment for the reception hall, picked out the wine, even approved the playlist for the band. Yet every now and then, his phone would buzz with a withheld number, and his fingers would freeze just above the screen, heart stammering like a flat tire on a gravel road. He never picked up. He told himself it was spam, or maybe some billing reminder from his old apartment back in Meriden Hill. Nothing that couldn't wait until after the honeymoon. Besides, this was a clean slate, wasn't it? With Lila, everything felt easy. Simple. Like standing barefoot on warm tiles after a cold shower. She never asked too many questions about his past. She trusted his silences, and maybe that was part of what drew him in, someone who didn't make his scars the topic of every sunrise. But love, no matter how new, never walks alone. It drags shadows by the hem. Lila Mercer, on the other hand, moved through the week like someone balancing a tray of crystal glasses on her head, graceful, steady, but quietly praying not to stumble. She had dreamed of this moment since she was a girl plaiting her doll's hair with torn ribbons and whispering imaginary vows to the ceiling. Now, with every step she took, there was a kind of sacred hush around her, as though even the air knew something precious was about to be born. Her small studio apartment smelled of lavender and starch, wedding cards piled beside her Bible, and her mother's necklace tucked into a drawer until Saturday. Her sister Mia had flown in from Oakview, flooding their evenings with squeals and wine-stained laughter, and between bouquet selections and seating charts, Lila often found herself standing still in the kitchen, holding a spoon, and staring out the window like she was trying to read the weather in her soul. She never said it aloud, but sometimes she wondered if she was too happy. If joy, when held too tightly, turned to glass, beautiful but breakable. She had once asked Daniel, gently, why he never mentioned his previous marriage beyond a tossed-off sentence. He had kissed her forehead and said, because it's like bad wallpaper, you strip it off and never look back. She laughed, then. But now, as she pressed her gown's hem against her chest and looked in the mirror, she remembered that moment, and the laugh felt a little stale in her mouth. She shook it off, whispered a prayer for peace, and returned to her list. Hope, after all, was a stubborn bird. Daniel's apartment that night was a canvas of cardboard and chaos. He had been living light, knowing he'd be moving into Lila's place after the wedding, and so half his things were either packed, dumped, or donated. The only thing that remained untouched was a large wooden chest that belonged to his mother, a hand-me-down of a hand-me-down, filled with fading photo albums, old tax returns, and papers from another life. Eleanor, his mother, had delivered it months ago, saying, "Keep this until I sort the attic." Daniel shoved it against the wall, promising himself he'd go through it once the wedding was done and dusted. That evening, though, he tripped over one of the handles while searching for cufflinks, cursed under his breath, and yanked it open with the annoyance of someone opening a wound they'd long ignored. Inside, among the jumble, were 3 thick envelopes stamped with legal crests, each labeled in handwriting he hadn't seen in years. Morgan Blake, his ex-wife. His pulse skittered. The dates were old, one from 18 months ago, one nearly 2 years. How had he missed this? He flipped through one, skimming words like paternity, custody petition, and pending dissolution. His hands trembled, eyes scanning for any forgery, but the notary stamps and lawyer signatures stared back like ghosts in daylight. Before he could process it, his phone rang again, another no-caller ID. This time, his thumb hovered longer. Then he pressed decline. He didn't need this. Not now. Not with everything so close to perfect. He buried the envelopes beneath sweaters he never wore and closed the chest. Some cans, he told himself, weren't meant to be opened, even if they rattled loud enough to wake the dead. At the rehearsal the next day, laughter flowed like warm syrup. The chapel was dressed in baby's breath and soft golds, and the pastor, a round, kind-eyed man who had known Lila since youth choir days, cracked jokes as he walked them through the ceremony. Daniel stood beside his best man, Malcolm, hands in pockets, cracking his neck every now and then like someone trying to stay loose before a high-stakes match. Lala was radiant. No other word would do. Her eyes danced when she caught his gaze, and even the corners of his doubt curled into something softer in her presence. But behind him, tucked into the last row, a woman in a slate-gray blazer with a faded baby bag at her feet watched them rehearse with eyes that had memorized his gait, the slope of his shoulders, the tremble in his laugh. She hadn't yet approached. She had come only to confirm, to see him say "I do" with someone else while their own story still lay unresolved like a sentence without a full stop. Morgan had made up her mind. She would not ruin the day. But her children deserved answers, and Daniel could no longer pretend the past was a city he had permanently moved out of. Some cities don't stop calling just because you changed your address. The twins had his eyes, and when the pastor asked, "Any objections?" come wedding day, she already knew the answer wasn't a question of if, but when. Morgan Blake had never planned to return to Brookhaven, not even in her wildest dreams or her worst nightmares. She had left that city with a belly full of borrowed hope and a heart that limped like a soldier returning from battle. When Daniel walked out on her, it wasn't with slamming doors or shouting matches. It was silence that killed them, the kind that grew vines around your throat and called it peace. He said he needed space to breathe, and she, half-blind with exhaustion from the fertility treatments, had nodded like someone agreeing to rain because the clouds had already gathered. What started as a temporary break became a severed rope, and she was too tired to tie it back. The final embryo, one single sliver of a chance, was left in her hands like a glass slipper after midnight. She hadn't told him when she made the decision. Not because she wanted revenge, but because she couldn't bear another conversation where love was treated like a line item in a budget. The procedure nearly flattened her, emotionally, financially, physically, but she told herself it was the last thing she would ever ask from life. Then came the test. Then came the ultrasound. Then came the twin heartbeat that sounded like a second chance echoing from somewhere far deeper than her chest. But carrying 2 lives in a rented apartment with no job and no partner wasn't a fairy tale. It was a war fought with peanut butter sandwiches and overdue rent notices. And still, she fought. She had moved to the outskirts of Redwood Valley, far enough from Brookhaven to disappear, but close enough for school districts with decent reputations. The twins, Theo and Tessa, were born screaming, as though protesting the world they'd entered. She loved them with the fierceness of someone who'd been betrayed by too many promises. Their diapers were bought with coins dug out of couch cushions, their formula sometimes stretched with guilt and watered-down prayers. Morgan worked late-night gigs whenever her neighbor, Mrs. Kirkland, could watch them. Warehouse inventory, online surveys, even temp call center slots where she pretended to be cheerful for strangers while holding back tears. She kept every receipt, every medical form, and every court notice in a fireproof folder she labeled reality. She had mailed the paternity suit papers twice and followed up with certified letters. When no reply came, she scraped enough to hire a legal aid rep who told her the case couldn't proceed without acknowledgement. Still, she waited. She thought perhaps he'd come around. Perhaps he'd even care enough to check if she survived the pregnancy. But silence became his answer. And so when her old classmate, Jenna Dorrance, messaged her a link to a wedding announcement, Daniel's wedding, something inside her finally broke loose. Not out of jealousy, not out of longing, but out of the simple, fierce need to stand in truth. The kind of truth that could stare into the eyes of children who would one day ask, "Did Daddy know about us?" and answer without flinching. She didn't pack much, just a small duffel bag, the twins' essentials, and the now fattened envelope of legal documents. The trip to Brookhaven was long and laced with the kind of silence that even cartoons couldn't fill. Theo kept asking when they'd get there, while Tessa stared out the window with eyes too knowing for a toddler. Morgan rehearsed what she would say 1,000 times in her head, only for the words to feel foreign when she opened her mouth. She wasn't coming to fight. She wasn't coming to beg. She was coming to remind a man of what he'd left unfinished, not just on paper, but in flesh and blood. There was no malice in her steps, only a woman bearing truth like a scroll, ancient and unburnable. As the bus pulled into the Brookhaven terminal, her stomach twisted itself into knots. The last time she stood in that city, she'd been somebody's wife. Now she was just somebody's memory. But the children clung to her legs like anchors, and she drew strength from their weight. By dusk, she had tracked down the chapel's name from the registry and took a cab to the outskirts where it stood like something from a postcard, stone walls, stained glass, and a garden full of rehearsed laughter. She didn't go in. Not yet. She just watched. From the shadows. From the place where unfinished stories wait to be rewritten. Morgan saw Daniel before he saw her. He looked older, not in years, but in distance, like someone who'd walked through a fog and decided not to look back at what got lost in it. He was laughing with his best man, a sound she used to love, deep, throaty, rich with mischief, but now it felt like it belonged to a different lifetime. The woman beside him, who could only be Lila, had a grace about her that wasn't performative. She moved like she trusted the ground under her, and Morgan found no reason to hate her. That was the hardest part. Lila looked kind. She looked like the sort of woman who wouldn't flinch if a child dropped juice on her white dress. And in that moment, Morgan's breath caught. Because this wasn't about spite. It wasn't about winning back a man or reclaiming a place. It was about drawing a line in the sand that children shouldn't have to cross alone. She turned to leave, but Theo sneezed loudly, and heads turned. For 1 second, Daniel's gaze locked onto hers. He blinked, his smile faltering. Recognition was aflame behind his eyes. He took a half-step forward, and Morgan shook her head slowly. Not here. Not yet. She tightened her grip on the twins and walked away from the chapel with her shoulders squared like a soldier. One more night. One more breath. And then she would say what needed to be said. Not for revenge, but for reality. Because paper might hide the truth, but children never do. The next morning crept in like a thief trying not to wake the house. Morgan sat on the edge of a borrowed guest house bed, elbows resting on her knees, her hands limp with the weight of choices she hadn't yet made. Theo and Tessa still slept, curled together like puzzle pieces that finally found their match, their soft breaths lifting the sheets in rhythm. Outside, the wind carried with it the distant bells of the chapel rehearsing its Sunday choir. She had almost walked away last night, almost let the silence continue to masquerade as peace, but her feet had refused to lie. She had come too far, carried too much, to melt into the background like a ghost without name or consequence. She reached for the fireproof envelope beside her, its corners dog-eared, its contents as heavy as her conscience. Birth certificates, certified letters, court notices, copies of old messages, proof not of vengeance, but of truth. She remembered what the lawyer said during one of those court sessions she attended alone, gripping her belly while trying not to cry. Until the father is identified and served, we're moving in circles. Well, the circle ended today. She wasn't looking to tear down an altar or burn a wedding dress. She only wanted her children to be recognized, not as shadows from a past swept under a rug, but as part of the same timeline Daniel stood on now, just walking a different lane. She didn't need to be applauded. She just didn't want to be erased. Back in the heart of Brookhaven, Daniel sat stiffly on a bench in Eleanor's living room, flanked by her floral curtains and judgmental silence. The old wooden chest from 2 nights ago still stood open, its contents spilled like secrets too tired to hide. Eleanor had made tea, but it sat untouched on the table, its steam fading just as fast as her excuses. "I thought it was best you didn't see them," she muttered finally, her eyes fixated on a spot somewhere between the coffee table and her shame. "You were finally happy, Danny. She was going to ruin that." Her voice cracked, but Daniel didn't look at her. His thumb brushed the court stamp on one of the envelopes, heart thudding like a boxer in round 12. "You had no right," he said, calm as a blade. "You had no right to choose what I should know." Eleanor opened her mouth, then shut it. There were no words that could soften the fact that her protection had worn the face of sabotage. "She had twins, Mom," he said finally. "I don't even know their names." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight. It pressed on the chests, sank in the bones. Daniel rose without finishing his tea and walked to the window. The city outside moved as if nothing had changed, but in his world time had just slipped a gear. Morgan hadn't just returned to stir trouble. She'd come with truth in both hands. And now he had to decide what kind of man he wanted to be in its presence. Lila was at the clinic, volunteering for her usual Saturday shift when the notification came in. She had just finished dressing a child's scraped knee when her phone buzzed, lighting up with an unfamiliar email header. Legal inquiry. Blake, Morgan versus Price, Daniel. Her hands went cold before her brain registered what she was reading. The words were clinical, pending dissolution, twin minors, custody mediation, but the ache they birthed was primal. She walked into the staff lounge like someone pulled underwater mid-step and closed the door behind her. Her fingers shook as she dialed Daniel's number. He picked up on the second ring, voice low, already coated in regret. "Lila," he breathed like her name was the only anchor he had left. "Why is there a legal file with your name and another woman's children on it?" she asked, not raising her voice, but not softening it either. He explained, stumbling through the mail he never read, the unopened letters, the discovery in the chest. She listened in stunned silence, the kind that doesn't explode, it implodes. "Were you still married when you proposed?" she asked finally. "I thought I wasn't," he replied, and the honesty in that broke something far deeper than lies ever could. She didn't hang up. She didn't cry. She said she needed time, then pressed her forehead against the staff room wall, tears sliding down her cheeks, not from betrayal, but from a kind of heartbreak that comes when the ground you trusted starts to tilt. Love wasn't a fairy tale. It was a ledger, and someone had failed to balance the pages. That evening, Morgan walked into Brookhaven's municipal family office alone, children left with a trusted sitter in town. Her shoes tapped softly against the tile floors, echoing louder than her heartbeat. The woman at the front desk raised her brows when Morgan handed over the envelope. "Delivery or filing?" the clerk asked. "Both," Morgan replied, firm. She signed the form, left a second copy in Daniel's name, and walked out with the kind of posture that belongs to people who've carried pain long enough to stop apologizing for it. Outside, the sun dipped low over the city's edge, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps. Meanwhile, Daniel stood at a street corner not far off, holding the birth certificates Morgan had left behind at the rehearsal venue earlier that day. He traced his name printed beside father, proof not just of biology, but of unfinished roads. When he looked up, the courthouse doors opened. Morgan stepped out, not seeing him. Their paths hadn't collided yet, but the air around them was heavy with inevitability. For a long moment, Daniel didn't move. He watched her disappear down the block, and something inside him cracked, not like glass breaking, but like ice melting. Quiet. irreversible. He didn't know where the road would lead next. But for the first time in years, he knew this much: running was no longer an option. The air inside St. Emery's Chapel was soaked with anticipation, thick enough to chew. Every row of white-cushioned pews had been perfectly arranged, each tied with ribbons so delicate they fluttered if you so much as sighed near them. Guests milled around in their Sunday best, speaking in hushed tones, their laughter polite, controlled, the kind that floats just above nerves. Outside, a string quartet rehearsed quietly under a canopy of roses, and the scent of perfume, cologne, and carefully chosen flowers swirled together like a cocktail of hope. Daniel stood just off the altar, fingers twitching at his sides, jaw clenched so tightly the muscles near his temple pulsed like drumbeats. His tuxedo fit like it was made of intention, every stitch flawless, every button symbolic, but beneath the fine fabric, his chest was a mess of wires. He had slept only 3 hours, not because he doubted Lila, but because the ghosts he had buried had returned with twin voices, brown eyes, and his own name written in black ink on legal sheets. The night before, he had stared at the twins' birth certificates until they blurred into each other, every line daring him to own what he once ignored. Malcolm, his best man, clapped him on the back gently and whispered, "You good?" Daniel nodded, but it was a nod made of glass. At that moment, he wasn't a groom. He was a man standing at the edge of a truth that could swallow the altar whole. The chapel doors closed with a soft thud as the organist began the processional tune. Everyone rose. Lila appeared in the doorway, wrapped in silk and serenity, her face glowing not just from makeup, but from the sheer force of belief. She walked with the grace of someone who still believed in tomorrows, even if yesterday had cracks. Every step she took was a thread stitching her to a man she trusted. She saw Daniel at the altar and smiled, that full-body kind of smile that made babies laugh and old men sigh with memory. Daniel watched her, throat dry as dust, his heart like a child hiding behind a curtain, peeking out and hoping not to be caught. He had told her everything the night before, every forgotten envelope, every unanswered call, every piece of a puzzle he didn't realize had been sitting at the edge of his life waiting to be assembled. She had said very little, only listened, her silence not sharp but deep, like a well with no bottom. Now, as she reached the front and took his hand, he whispered, "Thank you for still coming." She squeezed his fingers gently and whispered back, "Let's see if we make it out of this chapel first." The pastor began his speech, and the atmosphere shifted, charged, sacred, trembling. Then came the words that have broken hearts and rewritten histories. If anyone here knows a reason why these two should not be joined, speak now or forever hold your peace. It came not as a roar, but as a ripple, a soft commotion from the back, the sound of shuffling feet, a child sneezing, a paper bag crinkling. Then a voice, clear, low, almost unsure at first. "I do." It wasn't the voice that turned heads. It was what followed. Morgan stepped forward slowly, like someone walking through molasses, her face pale but resolute. She wore a navy blazer over a simple dress, her shoes dusty from travel, her shoulders squared like a woman ready to be hated but determined not to disappear. In one arm, she held a child, Tessa, who clung to her like ivy to stone. Theo stood beside her, one hand gripping her skirt, the other clutching a faded toy car. In Morgan's other hand was an envelope, thick, folded, dog-eared from battle. "I'm not here to ruin anything," she began, her voice rising as the room fell into an eerie hush. "But I can't stand by while the man at that altar pretends he's free to marry when he's still legally tied to me, and father to these two." A gasp floated through the crowd like a balloon losing air. One woman covered her mouth. Someone's phone fell with a clatter. The pastor, stunned, turned to Daniel. The silence was so loud it hurt. Daniel stepped forward, breath shallow, eyes locked on the envelope Morgan now held out like a verdict. He didn't deny her, didn't pretend she was mistaken. He simply whispered, I didn't know. Not fully. Morgan blinked. But you knew enough to ignore the signs. Lila stood perfectly still, a statue carved out of disbelief and grace. She didn't cry. She didn't run. She simply turned to Morgan and said, "Let's sit." Not a question, not a demand, just a pause, a breath inside the chaos. They moved to the first pew. Morgan placed the children gently beside her and handed the documents to the pastor, who examined them slowly, his hands trembling as the truth bled through ink and legal jargon. A lawyer among the guests, Daniel's cousin, was called forward. "The marriage can't proceed," he announced quietly. "There's an unresolved case on file. No divorce finalization. The license won't hold." The organist stopped playing. The candles flickered. And just like that, the wedding became a courtroom without walls. But amidst the unraveling, something unexpected happened. Theo crawled onto Daniel's lap, blinking up at him with a face so familiar it made Daniel's breath catch. "You look like me," the boy said simply, and something inside Daniel shattered and healed in the same moment. "I'm your dad," he said softly, voice breaking. Morgan turned away, tears filling her lashes, but not out of spite. Out of relief. Out of exhaustion. Out of the heavy mercy that comes when truth, finally spoken, stops feeling like betrayal. And Lila, watching them all, simply whispered to herself, "So this is what love looks like when it's bruised, but honest." The chapel had never seen a union that day, but it witnessed something just as rare, reckoning, raw and sacred, played out under stained glass and startled eyes. The morning after what should have been his wedding day, Daniel woke to a silence that wasn't peaceful, it was punitive. His apartment, still dressed in leftover decorations from pre-ceremony jitters, looked like the aftermath of a celebration that had been interrupted by an earthquake. Ribbons dangled like regrets, and the faint scent of cologne on his jacket mocked him with memories of what almost was. He sat at the edge of his bed, staring at the framed picture of him and Lila taken just 2 weeks before, both of them smiling, eyes full of plans, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. He hadn't spoken to her since the chapel. He didn't know how to begin. There was no sentence gentle enough to repair a woman's trust when she found out mid-vow that her groom had unfinished business with another woman and 2 children. Morgan hadn't come to destroy. She had come to declare. And in doing so, she didn't just halt a wedding, she flipped a switch Daniel had spent years avoiding. Now, there was no longer a clean separation between his past and present. The ghosts he once left behind had not only returned, they had names, voices, and eyes that looked just like his. Guilt, that shape-shifting intruder, sat beside him on the bed like an old friend with unfinished gossip. And Daniel, for once, didn't try to justify his silence. He simply let the weight of his choices settle over him like dust in a room that hadn't been opened in years. Elsewhere in the quiet wing of Brookhaven General, Lila sat in the break room of the clinic where she worked part-time, her hands wrapped around a lukewarm cup of tea she hadn't touched. She had come in that morning not out of duty, but out of habit, the kind of muscle memory you fall into when your mind is too clouded to trust your emotions. Her co-workers tiptoed around her, not out of fear, but out of kindness, like villagers giving wide berth to a woman carrying water in a cracked bowl. She hadn't cried, not in the chapel, not after. Her tears had folded themselves into a drawer inside her chest, locked beneath the shock of betrayal and the echoes of wedding bells that never rang. What hurt most wasn't the children. It wasn't even Morgan. It was the truth that Daniel had known there were questions unanswered, envelopes unopened, timelines blurred, and still chose to proceed like love was a bridge that could be crossed with one eye closed. Trust, for her, wasn't just about honesty. It was about foresight. About being the kind of person who sees a crack in the foundation and fixes it before building a home atop it. She wasn't angry in the way storms are. She was angry in the way glaciers are, slow, deliberate, deeply rooted. She had loved Daniel with her eyes open, believing he had done the same. But now the fog had lifted, and what lay before her wasn't ruin. It was raw, unfiltered truth. And as bitter as it tasted, there was a strange freedom in it. Meanwhile, Morgan sat across from a court-appointed mediator, documents spread out like playing cards between them. Her voice was calm, but her posture told a different story. Shoulders stiff, jaw locked, the kind of tension that clings to those who've had to fight too long just to be heard. She had expected resistance from Daniel, maybe even legal maneuvering from his family, but instead, what she got was surprising. Full acknowledgement, a signed agreement to recognize paternity, a co-parenting proposal drafted not in arrogance, but in humility. Daniel had shown up to the meeting 30 minutes early, not with a lawyer or a lecture, but with a binder of handwritten letters, one for each child and one for Morgan. The gesture hadn't melted her resentment, but it had disarmed her silence. "I didn't sign away my right to peace when I signed those fertility forms," she told him quietly. "But I also didn't ask to raise 2 children alone while you built a new life from scratch." He nodded, eyes lowered. "I can't go back and undo that," he said. "But I want to show up now. Not just for the twins. For all of it." There was a pause, then a quiet agreement. Shared custody, weekly visits, a trust fund co-managed with legal oversight. No favors. No fantasies. Just structure. Just truth. Morgan didn't smile, but for the first time in years, her breath came easier. She left the courthouse that day not vindicated, but validated. That evening, as the city lights flickered like quiet confessions across Brookhaven's skyline, Daniel stood outside the modest townhouse where Morgan now lived with the twins. It wasn't planned. He had stopped by with the court-approved calendars and dropped off a box of toys he remembered buying years ago but never giving. He didn't expect to be invited in, and Morgan didn't offer. Instead, they stood on the porch, the twins giggling somewhere inside, the sound slicing through the air like forgiveness trying to find its shape. "They'll have questions one day," she said softly, arms crossed against the night chill. "I know," he replied, "and I want to be able to answer them without stuttering." Morgan nodded once. "Then show up. No grand gestures. Just consistency." It wasn't a truce. It wasn't closure. But it was something human. As he walked back to his car, he caught a glimpse of Lila standing across the street. She had come by to return a book Morgan once lent her. Their eyes met, and the silence between them was not hostile, but unfinished. Lila walked up, handed the book to Morgan, then turned to Daniel and said, "You're going to have to rebuild. Not just the paperwork. The person." Then she left, her footsteps measured, her heart unsure, but her spine unshaken. Daniel stood there, caught between 2 women and 2 versions of himself. And for once, he didn't try to walk away. He just stood. Because sometimes, standing still is the first step in moving forward. 3 months had passed since the chapel silence had been broken by a voice carrying the weight of unfinished stories. In those 12 weeks, the city had moved on, the tabloids had found new scandals, and the wedding hall had hosted 2 other ceremonies that ended with rings and rice showers. But for Daniel, time hadn't simply marched forward, it had limped. He had moved into a smaller apartment near the courthouse, closer to the twins and neutral enough not to carry ghosts from any past life. The mornings were filled with cartoons, spilled cereal, and sticky fingers around his neck, and the nights were quieter than he was used to. He had traded in wedding suits for T-shirts with dinosaur stains, learned how to braid Tessa's stubborn curls with trembling hands, and begun reading parenting guides like they were sacred texts. Each day, he peeled off a layer of the man who thought silence was protection, who once mistook avoidance for peace. Morgan didn't make it easy, nor did she make it hard. She was simply present, clear in her expectations, strict in her boundaries, but respectful of the change she saw taking root. They were not friends, not yet, but they were no longer adversaries. They were co-authors of the same story now, two people who once walked away from the same fire, now building shelter in its ashes. And for the first time since his world had cracked open, Daniel felt a strange kind of gratitude, the kind that arrives not wrapped in joy, but wrapped in responsibility. Lila hadn't disappeared from his life like a vanishing act. Instead, she had retreated with the grace of someone who knew when to pause, but not necessarily end the song. She remained cordial, professional, and unflinchingly kind, which in many ways hurt more than if she'd screamed or cursed his name. Daniel had seen her twice since the courthouse, once at the pharmacy, where they exchanged polite nods over a shelf of vitamin gummies, and once at a charity drive, where she had brought donated books and he had arrived with the twins in tow. That second meeting held a different kind of silence, not wounded, not frozen, but waiting. They had stood beside the table of picture books, their hands brushing as they reached for the same one, and for a moment the air between them held all the things they hadn't said. "They're beautiful," she had whispered, watching Tessa tug Daniel's sleeve with a question about unicorns. "They look like they have stories to tell." Daniel nodded, smiling sadly. "I'm still trying to learn how to listen." Lila smiled, not with bitterness, but with the quiet approval of someone who sees change and decides not to punish the seed for where it sprouted. They didn't make plans. They didn't promise coffee. But as she walked away, she turned once, offered a small wave to the twins, and said, "Tell them I said they've got a brave mom." That night, Daniel wrote her a letter he never sent. Some truths, he realized, were meant for the soul, not the mailbox. Morgan stood in her small kitchen, watching the twins chase each other around the living room, their laughter rising like music from old vinyl, scratchy in places, but unmistakably alive. Her job at the bookstore was steady, the kind of work that didn't pay much, but filled her in a way that money couldn't. She spent her mornings stacking novels and her evenings stacking bedtime stories, and in between she learned to smile without flinching. The court dates were behind them. The custody calendar hung on the fridge like a stitched quilt, days in blue for Daniel, days in green for her, weekends split like apples down the middle. It wasn't ideal, but it was fair. And fairness, after all, was its own kind of freedom. She didn't regret walking into that chapel. Not anymore. There had been nights, yes, nights she cried into her pillow, wondering if she had made things worse. But those feelings had folded into something firmer. She had reclaimed her voice, not by screaming, but by standing still and refusing to vanish. Daniel was showing up now, not just for court-mandated hours, but for school meetings, for scraped knees, for Saturday cartoons, and meltdowns at bedtime. He was learning, sometimes fumbling, but trying. And that mattered. It mattered more than any apology. As the twins curled beside her that night, their small bodies warm against her sides, Morgan looked out the window and whispered a thank you to the silence that had once held her hostage. Because now she knew, some silences are just waiting for the right moment to be broken. That weekend, Brookhaven's Willow Park was alive with soft light and the easy hum of celebration. There was no altar, no organ, no guests dressed in stiff satin. Just a picnic mat spread under a jacaranda tree, paper plates stacked with snacks, and 3 adults seated on mismatched chairs as 2 children took turns kicking a yellow ball between them. Daniel had suggested it, a family circle day, he called it, and Morgan had agreed cautiously. Lila came too, by her own choice, holding a tray of cupcakes and a book tucked under one arm. It wasn't a triangle anymore, it was a circle, wider than it had once been, forged not by romance, but by resilience. They played Uno. They laughed when Tessa cheated shamelessly. When the sun began to dip, painting the sky in streaks of orange and lavender, Daniel stood to speak. "I never imagined this," he said, voice low but steady. "I never imagined a world where we all sit at the same table without flinching. But I'm grateful for the detour, for the confrontation, for the truth." Morgan raised her bottle of malt, and Lila nodded silently. The twins, unaware of the grown-up weight in the air, ran up and threw themselves onto the mat, giggling, their cheeks flushed with joy. And in that moment, it was clear no one had won. No one had lost, but everyone had healed something. The story didn't end in a vow or a kiss. It ended in laughter, in presence, in choices remade under honest skies. Not every wedding leads to forever, but some objections spoken in love do. Sometimes life doesn't break us to destroy us. It breaks us to reveal what was buried under the noise. In love, silence is not always golden. What we refuse to confront today can rise tomorrow wearing heavier shoes. So speak, ask, answer, and if someone stands with the truth in one hand and pain in the other, honor them. Healing doesn't always look like going back. It often looks like moving forward with open eyes, steady feet, and a cleaner heart. Whether you're Morgan, Daniel, or Lila in this story, may you find the courage to choose truth over pride and peace over performance. May your heart never be ignored when it speaks in truth. May your silence never become a prison, but a place where clarity is born. May the love you give find its way back to you, not always from the same hands, but from a source that honors your worth. If you've carried pain alone, may God send you companions who lift it with you. If you've made mistakes, may grace meet you before guilt does. May your past never dim your future, and may your steps from here echo with wisdom, kindness, and second chances that stick. May your home be full of laughter, your name be free from shame, and your days be rooted in honesty. In Jesus' name, amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.